establishing central presence, and preparing for queenside development with solid pawn structure. Opening the door for the bishop to participate in the early game skirmish. Seizing central space, white dares black to define their pawn structure early. Challenging white's central pawn chain immediately, this pawn thrust boldly fights for the initiative. Opening the center immediately forces black to decide between recapturing with a pawn, maintaining symmetry, or allowing a central pawn advantage for white. Reclaiming the center with the pawn reestablishes black's presence and opens lines for piece development, a crucial step in this dynamic exchange. Developing the bishop here opens diagonal lines and prepares for kingside castling, creating potential attacking avenues. Developing the bishop here offers a clear path for castling and prepares to contest the d-file. Unleashing the queen prematurely invites tactical skirmishes and potentially exposes her to enemy counterplay, demanding careful calculation. Unleashing a knight now contests central squares and prepares for king's knight development. Solidifying the center's pawn structure and preparing a kingside pawn storm, a common motif in this opening's variations. Developing the knight reinforces the center and prepares for castling, a sensible step in this dynamically balanced position. Reinforcing the kingside pawn structure prevents any immediate tactical incursions and prepares for queenside expansion. King safety achieved, black now aims to develop pieces harmoniously and contest the central influence. Developing the knight to an active square, aiming to support the center and prepare for kingside action. This knight bravely occupies the central outpost, challenging white's queenside and eyeing f2. Sacrificing the bishop for a temporary positional advantage opens up diagonals and disrupts black's central pawn structure. Opening the e-file now allows your pieces to breathe, preparing for coordinated action on the queenside. Recapturing the pawn simplifies things, but opens lines toward your king and grants black some activity. Probing the queen's position, this rook redistribution aims to pry open the e-file and challenge white's centralized lady. The queen returns to a more active diagonal, but the king's pawn structure remains a concern. Suddenly, black's queen aggressively occupies the kingside, creating immediate threats and forcing white to defend. Establishing central influence and preparing for development, this square offers more flexibility than previously. Repositioning the bishop to a more active square, aiming to challenge white's queen and develop counterplay on the queen side. Reclaiming the central tension and preparing for kingside expansion, this knight redeployment offers a dynamic counterpoint. Anchoring the rook to the open file immediately contests central influence, preparing potential pressure on the d-file. A necessary step to secure your monarch, preparing for the coming skirmishes on the central files. Recapturing on c8 prepares to develop the bishop to a more active diagonal and potentially join the attack on white's king. Reuniting the knights offers white better central control and prepares for a more active kingside presence. Broadening the king's defensive options, this prepares a subtle regrouping and potentially opens a diagonal for the bishop. Securing the e4 square with this knight initiates a potential attack on the kingside while reinforcing your central presence. Repositioning the bishop from the aggressive but potentially exposed square allows it to support potential pawn breaks while reinforcing the kingside's defensive structure. Unlocking the kingside for potential attacks, this maneuver clears the queen's path to the active d4 square. Unleashing the f-pawn rips open the kingside, initiating a daring counterplay against white's centralized pieces. Simplifying the position, white initiates a queen exchange, aiming to exploit black's somewhat exposed monarch and gain an endgame advantage. Liberating the bishop from its pawn chain opens intriguing diagonal possibilities. Targeting black's now exposed dark squares, this move aims to restrict the bishop's activity and create imbalances. Capturing the bishop relinquishes the initiative, opening lines that white's remaining pieces can exploit for a swift attack. Unleashing the knight into the enemy camp promises a dynamic struggle, potentially targeting vulnerable pawns. Expelling the knight creates an imposing pawn chain and slightly weakens the dark squares around black's king. Regaining control of the central light squares, this move aims to neutralize black's initiative and prepare for a more active middle game. Finally activating the king, preparing to contest the central files and potentially rally troops for a future queenside expansion. Reclaiming the open file immediately allows for pawn structure pressure and future rook infiltrations. Aggressively pushing pawns forward creates weaknesses around your monarch and opens lines for enemy pieces. Clearing the central file opens lines for immediate confrontation, forcing a decision on the e-file's fate. Recapturing the rook solidifies black's control of the open file and prepares for pawn advances. Recapturing the rook opens a vital central file, aiming to exploit black's slightly exposed king and limited piece mobility in the ensuing endgame. A pivotal exchange, simplifying into an endgame where white's king feels exposed on its current diagonal. Repositioning the knight to a more active square, aiming to control key central squares and prepare for pawn advances. Pushing the pawn forward creates a fascinating battle for central space and potentially opens a path for future attacking play. Consolidating the king's safety now becomes paramount as black's passed pawn advances. Reactivating the bishop to influence the d-file, it's a sound positional maneuver aiming to improve piece placement. Shifting the monarch centrally is often prudent when pawn structures become fragmented. Establishing piece mobility, this knight strategically redeploys to a more active central square. This maneuver repositions the knight for greater influence on the queen side, aiming to exploit the open e-file. Re-establishing the knight's central presence promises dynamic counterplay through the f-file. Asserting control over the queen side, nc5 aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and create attacking chances. Seeking to bolster the central pawn structure and prepare for a more active piece deployment. Unlocking the queenside pawns aims to generate queenside play, potentially creating a passed pawn. Chasing the white king with your own monarch offers a dynamic shift, aiming to disrupt white's cramped position and potentially exploit the open diagonals. Consolidating knight placement begins to unlock potential endgame advantages. Expanding the queenside pawn structure aims to create queenside play, but weakens the pawn chain. Threatening to drive the knight back opens up the kingside for a potential pawn storm. Pushing the king forward into this complex central pawn structure might prove daring, exposing him to potential discoverable threats. Shifting the king towards the center prepares to contest the remaining open files and support pawn advances, a classic endgame maneuver. Positioning the bishop to the b7 square is a clever maneuver, aiming to pressure white's queenside pawn structure and prepare for potential endgame activity. Unlocking the d-file can create significant space for the king, but beware of its newfound exposure. A desperate king hunt, sacrificing tempo to disrupt white's consolidating position. Striking the knight clears a diagonal, potentially isolating black's passed pawn while centralizing white's king. King activity is paramount now, venturing forth to claim its share of the central pawns and disrupt the opponent's initiative. The knight repositions to a more active square, aiming to support the d-pawn's advance and potentially create passed pawn threats. Opening the queenside, this move aims to disrupt white's pawn chain and create counterplay, though it weakens the d5 square. Securing the queenside pawn structure prevents immediate penetration. Shifting the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to contest the important central files and potentially pressure white's king. Threatening the isolated d-pawn with a pawn storm brewing. Re-establishing central influence by retreating the king is essential for navigating the ensuing pawn structure and potential counterplay. Fortifying the king's escorting pawn allows for an eventual pawn push while solidifying this vital monarch. Pushing the h-pawn creates space for the king and eyes the f3 knight, initiating a potential queenside pawn race. Opening the queenside pawn structure offers a chance to untangle white's pieces. Unleashing the pawn chain forward creates immediate attacking potential on the king side, though it opens a new path for white's knight to infiltrate. Opening the kingside file now offers a clear path to victory by exploiting the exposed black monarch. Exploiting the open file, black initiates a risky pawn thrust to disrupt white's cramped position. Recapturing the pawn with the knight reestablishes central control and prepares for a kingside pawn push. Capturing that pawn momentarily simplifies things, but opens the c-file for a potential invasion. Opening the file offers a dynamic potential for rook infiltration or creating a passed pawn. The black king ventures forward, seeking active participation in the endgame's unfolding drama. Initiating pawn storm pressure on the kingside now, exploiting the open files. Unleashing a pawn chain reaction, black opens lines for dynamic counterplay. Recapturing here opens the g-file, creating a new avenue for the white king to potentially participate in the unfolding action. Challenging the pawn chain aggressively, this bid for space aims to open lines for the queen and disrupt white's coordination. Checkmate threat materializes as the knight penetrates the weakened pawn shield, forcing the king to a less secure square. The king's desperate dance continues, seeking refuge while pawns march forward. Cracking open the queenside pawns to exploit the exposed black king. Opening the queenside pawn structure now allows the black king to venture out, potentially disrupting white's coordination. Opening the c-file now promises a critical breakthrough, potentially exposing black's isolated pawn. Reclaiming the outpost on the queen side, the bishop now aims to disrupt white's pawn chain and potentially support advances. Pushing the passed pawn here aggressively asserts queenside space and forces black to defend.